Hey guys, tonight we begin a strange, slightly scandalous journey through history, but don't worry, it'll be in the slow, sleepy tone you know and love. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now settle in, maybe fluff your pillow, and let's drift into the strange shadows of medieval royalty. Let's start not with scandal but with a whisper. A soft hush behind velvet curtain. The kind of whisper that didn't just stir gossip, it swayed kingdoms. Because in the medieval world, queens weren't just decorative figures gliding around in stiff brocade gowns. They were deeply human, curious, bored, isolated, sometimes even inventive, and very, very lonely. Now before your imagination runs away, remember, this is history, and history, for all its fire and blood, is filled with absurd quiet moments. Like a queen who kept a dwarf dressed as a monk in her chambers for moral instruction, or a French consort who insisted that all of her male servants wear perfume and nothing else. Apparently, modesty was optional in the 14th century, so long as you owned the castle. Our story tonight floats gently into the reign of Queen Isabella of France, sometimes called the She-Wolf of France. But long before she had that fierce nickname, Isabella was a teenager married off to Edward II of England, a king more interested in his male favorites than in his royal bride. He gave lavish gifts to Piers Gaveston, jewels, land, coronation. Meanwhile, poor Isabella received a cold bedchamber and rumors. You can imagine how that felt, surrounded by spies, ignored by her husband, the court watching her every move. It didn't take long before Isabella found someone who did notice her. His name? Roger Mortimer, a baron. A rebel, a man with armor and ambition. Their affair would become one of the most infamous power couplings in English history. They didn't just get involved, they overthrew the king. That's one way to get someone's attention. But before we get to the coup, let's imagine a medieval evening in the queen's chambers. Candlelight, heavy tapestries, goblets of wine, a secret note hidden in the folds of a velvet sleeve. Lovers didn't have WhatsApp. They had poisoned ink, embroidered codes, and pillow talk layered with political strategy. Of course, Isabella was just one of many queens whose passions burned in palaces that smelled of damp stone and rose oil. There were others, stranger, wilder, but we'll get to them. For now, just drift with me. History isn't always grand battles and noble speeches. Sometimes it's a queen staring out a window, planning revenge, or dinner, or both. And the truth is, perversion, as they called it, often just meant defying what was expected. A queen who loved who she wasn't supposed to, who ruled when men told her not to, who laughed too loudly, or read poetry that wasn't properly chaste. In many ways, the label said more about the gossips than the queens themselves. So tonight, we begin not with judgment, but with curiosity. About power, about loneliness, about velvet masks and perfumed lies, about what it meant to be a woman locked in a world of cold corridors and hotter secrets. It may come as a surprise to learn that in the Middle Ages, royal bedrooms were rarely private. Courtiers, servants, ladies-in-waiting, and even scribes were often present for everything except the actual act itself. And even that was sometimes more of a public formality than an intimate moment. Queens weren't cloistered in luxurious silence, but instead surrounded by whispering attendants and, in some cases, a few overly curious monks scribbling notes on purity. Take Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France. Rumors swirled that she kept an unusually high number of male courtiers around her chambers, many of whom had absolutely nothing to do with state business, unless you count shirtless harp playing and aggressive wine pouring as politics. Her critics painted her as a seductress with diplomatic intent, her fans as merely a woman who enjoyed beautiful company and a warm fire. And yet, historians still argue whether she was scandalous or just lonely. The line between moral outrage and sheer boredom was thin in the court. A queen's flirtations, real or imagined, could bring down entire factions. Even a compliment to a courtier's velvet tunic could launch rumors thicker than her ermine cloak. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was said to have encouraged courtly love, which was a romantic and poetic tradition that somehow involved knights writing passionate letters, fighting duels, and occasionally ending up shirtless in Rose Garden. Did she start it? Probably not. Did she love it? Almost certainly. In England, Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife to the mentally fragile Henry VI, was accused of far too much influence over certain noblemen. What kind of influence? The kind that made Parliament nervous and the gossips ecstatic. As Henry slowly slipped into a fog of religious devotion and melancholia, Margaret was left to handle the politics, and, supposedly, some extracurricular male companionship. Of course, the same barons who labeled her a Jezebel also wanted her power. So, who's surprised? The more powerful a queen became, the more her reputation suffered. Because nothing offended a medieval nobleman more than a clever woman who didn't need his advice. And if she wore a crimson dress or liked to laugh too loudly at court banquets, clearly scandalous, a perversion if not outright witchcraft. Meanwhile, Queen Joanna of Naples had to marry 4 times, often under pressure, and once defended herself against charges of poisoning her husband by reminding everyone she wasn't that interested in him. Her later enemies claimed she hosted orgies, but the evidence? Mostly political cartoons drawn by clerics who were bad at drawing and worse at being subtle. Even when queens weren't particularly promiscuous, their enemies ensured they were remembered that way, because nothing sticks in history quite like a bit of whispered sin, especially if it's wrapped in lace and written in Latin. It was never about actual behavior. It was about appearances, influence, power, and the eternal fear that behind every drape and velvet curtain, a queen might be smiling at the wrong man and ruling just a bit too well. Let's drift now to Renaissance France, where Queen Marguerite of Valois, known better to her critics as Queen Margot, graced the court with powdered grace, scandalous poetry, and a private life that reads more like a fever dream than a royal biography. Born into the brutal chaos of 16th century France, where Protestants and Catholics were at each other's throats and poison was practically a condiment at royal dinners, Margot learned early that surviving the court meant playing every angle, including the lustful ones. Married off to Henry of Navarre in a political gamble, the wedding sparked the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre just days later. You'd think this would sour her taste for courtly affairs. Didn't. Margot had lovers, not the occasional nobleman who whispered verses under her window, but a rotating cast of admirers, poets, actors, soldiers, and sometimes, according to whispered rumors, her own bodyguards. The irony? Most of this was not done in secret. Margot wore her scandal like a perfume. Her apartments became notorious for nightly salons where wine flowed freely, intellect and innuendo danced hand in hand, and clothing was optional, depending on who was visiting. She was known to dress as a man on occasion, cloaked and booted, slipping into the city for assignations under the cover of night. Some called it perversion. Others saw it as power, unfiltered, dangerous, and dazzling. She had the appetite of a libertine and the sharp tongue of a scholar. And in a court full of men who flaunted their vices, she wore hers like a crown. Her brother, King Henry III, was no less flamboyant. In fact, the French court under their reign was less a palace and more a swirling masquerade of cross-dressing courtiers, painted faces, whispered affairs, and torchlit decadence. Margot fit right in. But even the wildest queens eventually fall from favor. Margot was imprisoned for years in the castle of Ussen, where she kept writing and, allegedly, entertaining visitors of questionable virtue. Eventually released, she returned to Paris older, wiser, still flamboyant. She would walk the city streets in velvet gowns, a white powdered face peeking from beneath an enormous ruff, and locals would whisper, "There goes Margot, the queen of scandal, the lady of too much." Was she perverted? Or was she simply refusing to be tamed? That's the thing about history. It tends to confuse autonomy with sin, and independence with depravity. Margot gave them what they feared most. A woman who answered to no one, who read erotic poetry and wrote her own, who loved loudly and refused shame. And so she lingers not just as a queen, but as a living contradiction in brocade. History called her lewd. Margot called it Tuesday. Now let's settle into the 14th century warmth of Naples, a kingdom sun-soaked and blood-stained, where Queen Joanna I ruled with both grace and what some might call a deeply problematic love life, or perhaps a deeply fatal one. Joanna ascended the throne young, too young for the political snakes that slithered through her court. Her first marriage was arranged before she could finish learning Latin, to Andrew of Hungary, a man she reportedly disliked from the moment she met him. He was awkward, Hungarian, and, according to Neapolitan nobles, not refined enough for their taste. Or hers. Andrew was soon found dead, hung from a balcony by conspirators whose names have been lost to history, except, of course, for Joanna's. Because when your husband is murdered in your palace, and you benefit from it, and no one is ever punished, well, let's just say rumors travel faster than court messengers. But did Joanna mourn? Briefly. politically. Then she married again, and again, and again, for husbands each more powerful, handsome, or useful than the last. And behind each royal wedding came the usual court whispers, poisons in wine goblets, strangled lovers, tragic accidents involving staircases and swords. No hard evidence, just the kind of scandal that sticks to a queen's name like blood on brocade. One husband died in battle. Another might have died of grief or Joanna's temper. The fourth she outlived, which was an accomplishment in itself. But marriage was only part of the tale. Joanna's court was famous or infamous for its erotic undercurrents. Lovers slipped in and out of her bedchamber under the moonlight, and the palace at Naples became known as a place where morality came to sunbathe and forgot to leave. Clerics complained. Nobles watched in awe. The Pope himself got involved twice, once excommunicating her and once forgiving her, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval politics and papal spine. Was she a murderer? Maybe. Was she a lover of passion and power, determined to reign as a woman in a man's world, unapologetic in her pleasure? Certainly. Joanna's story ends, ironically, the same way many of her husbands did, violently. She was smothered with a pillow by her enemies, in a silent room where the air must have tasted like revenge. But her legend, that survived. Not just as the queen who outlasted for royal marriages, but as the woman who ruled Naples with a jeweled hand and a private life that made confessors nervous. She wasn't just a perverted queen. She was a woman who refused to be devoured by the men around her, so sometimes she devoured them first. Yes, Catherine the Great, perhaps the most over-mythologized monarch in European history. A woman whose actual accomplishments were so immense, so sweeping, so transformational, that naturally we remember her for a bedroom rumor involving a horse. Spoiler, it never happened. But when you're a powerful woman in the 18th century, ruling an empire the size of a continent, people will invent anything to explain your dominance, except that you were smarter than everyone else. Catherine was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess with the odds stacked against her. She married into the Russian royal family, a deeply dysfunctional mess of powdered wigs, drunken duels, and courtly paranoia. Her husband, Peter III, was emotionally stunted, fond of toy soldiers, and quite possibly repulsed by women, including his wife. So Catherine did what many queens did when trapped in a dead marriage. She took lovers. Not discreetly, not in shame. She built a well-documented and arguably state-sponsored rotation of handsome, obedient men whose primary qualifications were loyalty, charm, and strong thighs. They were gifted titles, lands, palaces. One was made a count for his performance. Another got a small army. At least one was a teenager, handpicked by her advisors to keep her calm. That's right, Russia had a budget line for Catherine's sexual satisfaction. That's empire. And yet, she wasn't ruled by desire, she ruled with it. Under her reign, Russia modernized. She corresponded with Voltaire, reformed laws, expanded territory, and carried herself like a Roman empress wrapped in furs. She crushed rebellions, played the chessboard of European diplomacy like a master, and outlasted every man who tried to control her. Of course, men of the 18th century didn't appreciate this. They called her nymphomaniacal. They spread lurid tales about her appetites. And eventually, they decided that if no man could conquer her, maybe a horse could. Hence, the myth, the story, invented long after her death, involved a harness, a stallion, and a mechanical lift. It was absurd, physically impossible, and yet the kind of thing that sticks to a woman's legacy when she refuses to be demure. Because it's easier, isn't it, to imagine a powerful woman as grotesque rather than brilliant? The truth is, Catherine wasn't perverted. She was simply unashamed. She wanted love and ruled like she deserved it. Her lovers weren't her weakness, they were her tools, and when they got dull, she replaced them. No need for scandal, just paperwork. She died in her bed, surrounded by servants, maps, and velvet. No horses, just empire. And yet the myth lives on, because people would rather whisper filth than speak of a woman who reshaped Russia with a pen in one hand and a general in the other. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness, like most royal diagnoses, was suspiciously political and conveniently timed. Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who gave Christopher Columbus his travel allowance, was never supposed to rule. She had older siblings, stronger heirs. She was the spare, the quiet one, the melancholic girl who preferred books and prayers to court dances and war horses. And yet, by a series of timely deaths and unfortunate marriages, she became the heiress to one of the largest empires in the world. She also fell catastrophically in love. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, was indeed handsome, Austrian jawline, golden curls, princely arrogance. Joanna, to put it plainly, lost her mind for him, but not in the way history has suggested. She didn't howl at the moon or froth at the mouth. Her so-called madness was far more tragic and, frankly, human. She grew jealous, desperate, unhinged when he strayed, which he often did. And when he died, suddenly, suspiciously, possibly poisoned, Joanna fell apart in a way that unsettled the crown. She refused to bury him. That's not a metaphor. She literally traveled around Castile with his corpse, opening the coffin to gaze at his face, talking to him, guarding his body against imagined seductresses. She slept beside the coffin, kissed his cold lips, and insisted his soul still lingered. Was this perversion, necrophilia, or just grief without instruction? Men wrote the histories. They called her mad. But what is more disturbing? A queen who mourns too long, or a court that finds her inconvenient and locks her away for 46 years? Yes, they did that. Her own father, then her son, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, kept her imprisoned in Tordesillas, a gloomy convent fortress where the windows rarely opened and the walls echoed with rumors. She was kept in dim rooms, visited by priests and guards, fed just enough to keep breathing but never enough to resist. They said she screamed, refused to bathe, feared being poisoned. Maybe some of it was true. Maybe it was a queen unraveling. Or maybe it was a woman trapped, silenced, and made into a cautionary tale. And even as she wasted away in seclusion, Joanna remained technically queen. Her seal still used, her name still stamped, a puppet monarch in the shadows, conveniently labeled insane whenever she became inconvenient. So was she perverted, as the whispers claim? No, she was obsessed, devoted, desperately in love with a man who used her, then abandoned her through death. She was a mirror of grief so raw that even kings flinched. And when the world couldn't handle her sorrow, they called it madness. They built walls, and they buried her long before she died. Some queens ruled empires. Some seduced bishops or rode astride armored stallions into battle. And then there was Berengaria of Navarre, who, in the great tale of medieval oddities, became infamous for what she didn't do. She married Richard the Lionheart. Yes, that Richard, the crusading, lion-hearted, never home for Christmas king of England. The warrior king who spent more time on horseback in foreign deserts than he did sitting on any English throne. Their wedding was swift, political, and deeply unromantic. She met him in Sicily, because where else would you plan a royal wedding except a sunny island with open sea routes to Jerusalem? They were wed, crowned, and within a few weeks separated. Not emotionally, physically. Richard sailed off to the Holy Land. Berengaria remained behind. He had wars to fight, Saracens to slay, and probably other companions to entertain him along the way. She, on the other hand, had vows and solitude. What's strange isn't just that they were apart. Many royal marriages operated like business partnerships. What's stranger is that they may have never consummated the marriage. That's right. Queen Berengaria may have died a virgin, and not for lack of trying, but because her husband simply wasn't interested. At least not in her. You see, rumors trailed Richard like a battered cloak. Whispers that he was more fond of male company than was considered proper. Chronicles hint at too many close friendships with too many handsome knights. French chroniclers, not known for subtlety, openly questioned his appetite for women, which left Berengaria in a very awkward position. A queen without a proper wedding night, a wife with no heir, and eventually, a widow whose husband barely acknowledged her existence. After Richard's death, she retired quietly to the French countryside. She prayed. She donated to convents. She never remarried. History mostly forgets her, except when she's reduced to a historical punchline. The queen who couldn't tempt a king. But is that fair? Is it perverse to live an entire queenly life untouched? Is it a scandal when the scandal is the absence of one? Berengaria's story is one of silence. No rebellions, no affairs, no drama. And in a world obsessed with sex, scandal, and succession, her purity, whether chosen or imposed, becomes almost suspicious. She was a queen who wore the title, bore the burden, but never felt the crown's weight in the marital bed. Her reign was spiritual, her body untouched, her name etched into history not with fire, but with fog. Some queens used their bodies to win wars. Berengaria used hers to remind us that sometimes the quietest stories are the strangest of all. Some monarchs wrote treaties. Some held councils. Queen Joanna I of Naples? She married them, again and again, and sometimes she may have unalived them too. Joanna came to the throne at just 16. A teenage girl handed a kingdom like a poisoned goblet. Naples, in the 14th century, was a cauldron of scheming nobles, aggressive clergy, and cousins who smiled with one hand on the dagger. Her first marriage was to Andrew of Hungary, her cousin, because of course, the marriage was arranged to strengthen claims, not affections. Andrew was awkward, foreign, and very Hungarian in a court that preferred Italian flair and political finesse. And when he started demanding to be crowned king alongside her, everyone got a little nervous. One night, while the royal couple vacationed in the picturesque town of Aversa, Andrew was dragged from his bed, strangled with a curtain cord, and thrown from a window. Charming, Joanna, naturally, denied any involvement. But as queen, she offered no vengeance, no justice, just a swift remarriage and a nervous smile. Her next husband, Louis of Taranto, was bold, handsome, and far more palatable to the Neapolitan court. But the sheen wore off fast. He became controlling, power-hungry, and altogether less charming once he had a crown. Still, he lasted a while. Then came James IV of Majorca briefly. He had ambitions, she had tolerance. It didn't last. Finally, she married Otto of Brunswick, husband number 4. By this point, Joanna had a bit of a reputation, not just for collecting spouses, but for being mysteriously unlucky with them. But her true scandal lay not in whom she married, but in whom she opposed. You see, when Pope Urban VI declared a rival papacy in Rome, Joanna threw her support behind the Avignon Pope, because nothing says perversion quite like backing the wrong Holy Father. For that, she was excommunicated, captured by a distant cousin, who just happened to be backed by the other pope, and allegedly smothered with a pillow. Yes, her life ended as undramatically as one of her husbands, silent, soft, and deadly. Was Joanna perverted? Not sexually, perhaps, but politically, absolutely. She bent the rules of queenship into shapes never before seen. She ruled in a world where women were meant to smile, not scheme. She smiled and schemed anyway. She turned marriage into politics, power into pleasure, and her enemies into forgotten footnotes. A queen with 4 husbands, no heirs, and a trail of scandal thicker than the velvet cushions in her court. If that's not medieval mischief, what is? Let's now pivot from pillow smothering to paperwork, from sweaty scandals to cold, calculated domination. Because not all perversion needs to be physical. Some of it can be political, utterly, obsessively political. Queen Margaret I of Denmark was not what you'd call perverted in the carnal sense. In fact, by most records, she was rather chaste. No lovers, no affairs, no beds warmed by ministers or monks. But her passion? Her real obsession? Power. And not the dainty kind. She was born in 1353, daughter of the Danish king, married off to the King of Norway, and quickly became a widow. Most royal women in that position faded into the background, respected, maybe, but irrelevant. Margaret had other plans. After her husband's death, she didn't return to Denmark for retirement and embroidery. She stayed in Norway, then took Sweden, then, for good measure, reclaimed Denmark too. All under the banner of her young son, until he died. So Margaret did something beautifully twisted for the time. She ruled in her own name, not as regent, not as queen consort, but as all-powerful lady and mistress of the Kalmar Union, a glorious political Frankenstein that united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her silk-gloved fist. She appointed puppet kings. She outmaneuvered bishops. She restructured laws and councils so that no decision could be made without her whisper behind it. And while everyone looked for a scandal in her bedroom, she gave them one in their ledgers, their treaties, their armies. No lover, no scandal, no royal bed-hopping, just a perverse addiction to order and control. She wore male clothing at times, not to confuse but to command. She spoke not like a queen, but like a sovereign. In a world where women were asked to inspire greatness in men, she simply became the greatness itself. Is that not its own form of medieval perversity? A queen who didn't bow to lust, but to structure, who didn't rule beside a king, but alone, who didn't scandalize the court with liaisons, but with competence. Margaret never remarried, never bore more children, never relinquished the reins. She didn't need passion to rule, just patience and an iron will. In a century of queens who used beds to gain power, Margaret used silence, strategy, and signatures, and in doing so, she rewrote what it meant to be a woman with a crown. No sensual whispers, no trysts behind tapestries. Just one woman, holding 3 kingdoms in her palm, and not letting go. Now, we arrive at one of the strangest love stories ever to be locked in the royal annals. Not the kind with grand kisses on balconies or noble sacrifices in war. No, this one involves a coffin, a literal corpse, and a queen who refused to let go. Joanna of Castile, known to history, somewhat cruelly, as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. But madness is a tricky word, often used by men to explain what they cannot understand. And Joanna? She loved, madly, deeply, perhaps too much. Born in 1479, daughter of the famed Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, Joanna was married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a Habsburg, charming, beautiful, manipulative, and utterly unfaithful. Joanna, however, adored him, worshipped him, obsessed over him with the kind of fever usually reserved for saints or stalkers. When Philip cheated, which he often did, Joanna reportedly raged. She wept, screamed, tore at other women's hair in public. She once ordered a lady-in-waiting's hair chopped off because Philip had admired it. She accused nuns of seduction, priests of meddling. It was messy. It was embarrassing. It was also very human. Then the twist. Philip died, quite young. Some say from fever, others whisper poison. Joanna was devastated, but where most grieving queens would retreat into black gowns and long silences, Joanna did something far more medieval. She refused to bury him. Instead, she ordered his coffin carried with her everywhere she went. She traveled across Castile at night, avoiding tempting women. Because she believed even in death, other ladies might seduce her Philip. She stopped at monasteries, opened the coffin to gaze upon his decaying face. She slept beside it. She kissed it. Yes, that coffin was her bedfellow. For years, her courtiers were horrified. Her parents were alarmed. Her children were confused. But Joanna kept moving, like a royal ghost, trailing her dead lover across the cold hills of Spain. Eventually, her father Ferdinand had enough. He locked her away in a convent. For her safety, they said. For the kingdom's peace, they added. But was she truly mad? Or was she simply a woman in a world that couldn't tolerate female passion unless it was quiet, proper, and manageable? Joanna's tale isn't perverted in the vulgar sense. It's perverted by grief, by a love too intense for her time. A woman who didn't let go, not because she didn't understand death, but because she couldn't accept it. And isn't there something oddly poetic about that? While kings remarried within weeks of a queen's death, Joanna clung to one man, body and soul, even when the body had long since begun to rot. Call her mad if you must, but know that her madness was devotion, unfiltered, terrifying, and as eternal as the stone vaults where her Philip now sleeps, alone. Finally, power, like wine, does strange things to the mind, and for Empress Irene of Byzantium, it tasted better when consumed alone, without interference from one's own child. Irene of Athens wasn't born into power. She married into it. Selected as the bride for Leo IV, the Byzantine emperor, she became Augusta, the empress, and then, through death and political patience, regent for her son, Constantine VI. But Irene was not content to be a footnote in a man's story, even when that man was her son. Constantine was young, rash, and eager to rule. Irene was older, wiser, and fully unwilling to let go of her throne. So the two clashed, politically, ideologically, and very publicly. They fought over everything, from iconoclasm to imperial advisors. The court was divided, the people were confused, and eventually, Irene did what any loving mother with a taste for unchecked autocracy might do. She had him blinded. Yes, blinded. Not poisoned. Not exiled. Not imprisoned. She chose the most symbolic, irreversible, biblical method of disqualification. On a dark night in 797 CE, Constantine was seized in his palace. His eyes were gouged out. Some say with hot irons, others claim it was more crude. Either way, the result was permanent. A son robbed of sight by the mother who bore him. It wasn't just about cruelty. Blinding was the Byzantine method of removing rivals without killing them. A blind man could not be emperor. He was physically unfit to rule. It was, in a way, an elegant political statement. But elegant doesn't mean sane. After the blinding, Irene ruled alone. For the first time in Byzantine history, a woman was sole ruler of the empire. She even dropped the title empress and had coins minted declaring herself Basilius, the male word for emperor. Rome gasped. Constantinople murmured. The Pope in the West decided this meant there was no legitimate emperor in the East, and promptly crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. Irene had altered not just a dynasty, but the trajectory of Europe itself. All because she couldn't share. But her reign wouldn't last. Power never stays loyal. She was eventually overthrown, exiled to Lesbos, and forced to spin wool to survive, reduced from empress to peasant, from blinder of emperors to forgotten widow. Was Irene perverted? Not in the sensual sense, perhaps, but in the darker meanings of the word. Her love for power was unnatural. Her ambitions curved away from motherly duty into something cold and gleaming and sharp. She is remembered not for her beauty or her grace, but for a terrible silence that followed a scream in a palace chamber, the silence of a son who would never see again, and for the mother who slept peacefully afterward. Love, they say, makes people do strange things, write poetry, cross continents, lose sleep, occasionally, exhume a decaying body and sleep beside it for years. Enter Joanna of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the power couple who gave the world Columbus and the Spanish Inquisition, Joanna was never expected to rule. She had siblings, she had time, she had, it seemed, freedom, but then fate, in its usual catastrophic style, rearranged the pieces. Her elder siblings died, so did their children, and suddenly, the once spare daughter was the heir to the Spanish throne. But that wasn't what made her infamous. That honor belonged to her husband, Philip the Handsome, an Archduke of Austria and a man whose looks were said to melt court ladies like candle wax. Joanna was completely, destructively in love with him, and unfortunately, he was utterly unworthy of it. Philip was charming, adulterous, and bored of monogamy before their first child was out of diapers. Joanna, already high-strung, became paranoid. She lashed out, screamed, fought his mistresses in public. At one point, she cut the hair of a lady-in-waiting out of sheer jealousy. But things took a darker turn in 1506 when Philip died, suddenly perhaps from typhoid or poison, depending on whom you ask. Joanna unraveled. She refused to bury him. She kept the coffin nearby. She opened it often. She slept beside it, carried it with her on long, eerie midnight processions, trailing through Castilian villages with her dead husband in tow. At one point, she ordered that no other woman was to come near the coffin, because even in death, her husband was hers alone. Now, was she mad? Was she grieving? Or was she a queen caught in a world where female emotion was labeled hysteria? Hard to say, but her behavior unsettled the court. The nobles, her father, so Ferdinand, ever the practical king, had her declared insane and locked her in the convent of Tordesillas. She remained there, more or less imprisoned, for the rest of her life. Nearly 5 decades, her only company, her ladies, her memories, and, for a time, a royal corpse that grew more skeletal by the day. History loves to debate Joanna's mind. Was she mentally ill? Or was she merely an inconvenient queen in a world that feared female power laced with passion? We'll never know for certain, but she remains one of the most haunting figures of medieval royalty, a woman consumed by love or madness, or perhaps a little of both. A queen who would rather sleep beside a rotting body than let go of the man who betrayed her. Because in the quiet shadows of castle halls, grief can rot faster than flesh. And sometimes, it's the heart, not the mind, that goes mad first. Love, they say, makes people do strange things, write poetry, cross continents, lose sleep, occasionally, exhume a decaying body and sleep beside it for years. Enter Joanna of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the power couple who gave the world Columbus and the Spanish Inquisition, Joanna was never expected to rule. She had siblings, she had time, she had, it seemed, freedom, but then fate, in its usual catastrophic style, rearranged the pieces. Her elder siblings died, so did their children, and suddenly, the once spare daughter was the heir to the Spanish throne. But that wasn't what made her infamous. That honor belonged to her husband, Philip the Handsome, an Archduke of Austria and a man whose looks were said to melt court ladies like candle wax. Joanna was completely, destructively in love with him, and unfortunately, he was utterly unworthy of it. Philip was charming, adulterous, and bored of monogamy before their first child was out of diapers. Joanna, already high-strung, became paranoid. She lashed out, screamed, fought his mistresses in public. At one point, She cut the hair of a lady-in-waiting out of sheer jealousy. But things took a darker turn in 1506 when Philip died, suddenly, perhaps from typhoid or poison, depending on whom you ask. Joanna unraveled. She refused to bury him. She kept the coffin nearby. She opened it often. She slept beside it, carried it with her on long, eerie midnight processions, trailing through Castilian villages with her dead husband in tow. At one point, she ordered that no other woman was to come near the coffin, because even in death, her husband was hers alone. Now, was she mad? Was she grieving? Or was she a queen caught in a world where female emotion was labeled hysteria? Hard to say, but her behavior unsettled the court. The nobles, her father, so Ferdinand, ever the practical king, had her declared insane and locked her in the convent of Tordesillas. She remained there, more or less imprisoned, for the rest of her life. Nearly 5 decades, her only company, her ladies, her memories, and, for a time, a royal corpse that grew more skeletal by the day. History loves to debate Joanna's mind. Was she mentally ill? Or was she merely an inconvenient queen in a world that feared female power laced with passion? We'll never know for certain, but she remains one of the most haunting figures of medieval royalty. A woman consumed by love or madness, or perhaps a little of both. A queen who would rather sleep beside a rotting body than let go of the man who betrayed her. Because in the quiet shadows of castle halls, grief can rot faster than flesh. And sometimes, it's the heart, not the mind, that goes mad first. If you want to find a woman who was simply too much for medieval Europe to handle, look no further than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Too wealthy, too clever, too bold, too beautiful, and far too involved in everything women were meant to politely avoid. She wasn't merely a queen. She was 2 queens. First, Queen of France, then Queen of England. A rare feat, and even rarer was the way she commanded power in both courts. Her story begins in the sunny vineyards of southern France. As the Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor inherited an enormous and cultured territory, a region known for troubadours, poetry, courtly love, and let's be honest, a relaxed attitude toward romance. At just 15, she married Louis VII, King of France. But Louis, pious and pale, was not made for Eleanor. He preferred fasting and crusades. She preferred music and banquets. While accompanying him on the Second Crusade, Eleanor allegedly scandalized the camp by riding in armor, like an Amazon, surrounded by her ladies dressed as soldiers. She may not have fought, but her presence alone blurred too many lines. Worse, the rumors began that she had become too close with her uncle, Prince Raymond of Antioch, that she had an affair under the burning sun of the Levant, that her beauty distracted the army and doomed the mission. And when she returned to France, she'd had enough. The marriage was annulled, but she wasn't done, not even close. 8 weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England, a man 11 years younger, fiery, ruthless, her equal. Together, they built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. They had 8 children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and the infamous John. And yet, Eleanor was more than a broodmare. She was a patron of the arts. She held her own court, where she presided over debates about love, fidelity, and desire. She invented the concept of courtly love, where women were the judges and knights the willing fools. In some stories, Eleanor's court sounds less like a political gathering and more like a medieval TED Talk meets a very classy sex symposium. She encouraged open discussion of passion and romance, poetry that spoke of longing, of unrequited desire, of the exquisite torment of love forbidden. It was elegant, philosophical, but let's not pretend it wasn't also risque. She was also dangerous. When her husband Henry became too tyrannical, Eleanor supported her sons in rebellion against their father. She was imprisoned for nearly 15 years, not for her crimes, but for her independence. Even behind bars, she remained queen. When Henry died, she emerged from the shadows like a seasoned chess master, advising her sons, arranging marriages, and governing with quiet efficiency. In her final years, Eleanor became a respected elder, but not a tame one. She had lived loudly, dressed boldly, loved deeply, traveled farther than most men of her time. She had been queen, duchess, crusader, rebel, poet, prisoner, and power broker, and she never once asked for permission. If she was perverted, it was only in the eyes of a world that feared female autonomy, a world that whispered too much whenever a woman refused to be small. And Eleanor? She never once made herself small. Now let us descend into the sun-soaked, blood-stained corridors of southern Italy. Naples, 14th century. A city humming with scandal and secrets. At the center of it all, Joanna I of Naples, a woman history could never quite decide whether to love, fear, or condemn. Joanna inherited the throne at just 15 years old. Crowned Queen of Naples, Countess of Provence, and ruler of several other lands most scribes could barely pronounce. But power did not come gift-wrapped, came with enemies, especially because Joanna had a small flaw: she kept outliving her husband. Her first marriage, to Prince Andrew of Hungary, was arranged when both were children. But Andrew, being Hungarian, had his own ideas. His advisors pushed for him to become co-ruler. Joanna declined, politely at first, then permanently. One night in 1345, Andrew was found strangled and thrown from a balcony. A tidy, almost poetic end. His murder shocked Europe, but shocked no one in Naples. The question wasn't if Joanna was involved, it was how deeply. And yet she survived it. Clever, poised, unapologetic. The Pope summoned her for questioning. She sailed to Avignon in luxurious morning black, charmed everyone, cleared her name, and returned to her throne as if nothing had happened. Her second husband didn't last long either, nor the third. She tried a fourth. None brought her peace, but they brought her power, temporary alliances, convenient distractions. One lover was allegedly beaten to death with a metal stick by her jealous third husband. Another, a handsome courtier named Charles of Durazzo, later led an invasion against her. So yes, Joanna's love life read like the script of a soap opera where every episode ends in poison, betrayal, or a papal intervention. But to say she was perverted, well, that was the convenient judgment of her male rival. When she defended her rule, they called her immoral. When she remarried, they called her unchaste. When she ruled alone, they called her dangerous. She even dared, prepare yourself, to support the wrong pope during the Western Schism. She picked Clement VII, a bad gamble, because the other pope, Urban VI, declared her deposed and endorsed her cousin Charles to take the throne. Charles, a man she had once nurtured, invaded Naples, captured her, imprisoned her, and in 1382, he had her smothered with a cushion in a castle dungeon. A soft end for a hard life. History later painted Joanna as a femme fatale, a queen whose bed was her battlefield, a woman whose husbands died too conveniently. But underneath the scandal was a ruler navigating a world where women weren't allowed to rule at all, unless they played dirty. She may have sinned, she may have schemed, but she also governed, negotiated, and survived for nearly 4 decades in a kingdom full of knives. In the end, Joanna wasn't perverted. She was strategic. She used love as a weapon because she had no army. And when she fell not because of lust, but because she picked the wrong pope, which, in medieval Europe, was far more dangerous than anything done in the bedroom. And now, let us drift northward to the snowy, stoic kingdom of Sweden, where in the 17th century, a queen ruled who was so deeply strange, so stubbornly out of place, that even her enemies couldn't look away. Christina of Sweden, crowned as a child, dressed like a man, acted like a philosopher, and lived like someone who had little patience for the expectations of her sex. Born in 1626, Christina was the only surviving legitimate child of King Gustavus Adolphus. When her father died in battle, she became queen at the age of 6. From that point on, things went sideways. Christina was raised like a boy by her father's wish. She studied military strategy, classical philosophy, and the finer arts of defiance. She refused to wear dresses. She refused to marry. And she refused to be feminine, describing herself as having the heart of a man. Historians have long puzzled over her. Was she eccentric, or simply uninterested in convention? Was she a lesbian? Was she transgender? Or simply a brilliant, reclusive intellectual who didn't care to explain herself to anyone? What is certain is that Christina did not play by the rules of queenship. She surrounded herself with male scholars and foreign courtiers. She invited artists, scientists, and philosophers to her court. She adored French thinker René Descartes so much, she brought him to Stockholm, where he promptly caught pneumonia and died in the cold. Christina was said to be unmoved. Marriage? That idea bored her. Her council pressed her to choose a husband, as they always do in these stories, and she, predictably, resisted. Eventually, she named her cousin as heir and abdicated the throne. Yes, gave it up, voluntarily. She rode out of Sweden dressed in men's clothing and converted to Catholicism, abandoning her Protestant crown for the warmth of Rome and the drama of courtly exile. In Rome, Christina played queen without a kingdom. She hosted salons, meddled in politics, and baffled everyone with her sharp tongue and refusal to behave. Her gender presentation remained deliberately ambiguous. Some days she wore gowns, other days she wore boots and breeches. When asked why she never married, she simply replied, "I do not intend to give myself to a man. I am too proud for that." Her relationships were equally mysterious. Some suggest romantic entanglements with women like Ebba, her lifelong companion, though nothing was ever confirmed. Christina kept her secrets close, and though she never ruled again, she remained a political creature, plotting, scheming, and demanding to be remembered. When she died in 1689, she was given the rare honor of being buried in St. Peter's Basilica, a strange final resting place for a Protestant-born monarch who defied nearly every standard a queen was expected to uphold. Was she perverted? Only if independence is a perversion. Only if refusing to marry, love men, or stay within the lines of gender is considered scandalous. More accurately, Queen Christina of Sweden was an enigma, a ruler who wanted freedom more than crowns, a woman who never fit the mold and never wanted to. She reminds us that the most rebellious queens weren't always lascivious. They were often just brilliant, unwilling, and absolutely uninterested in playing the part written for them. Let us now dim the lights and return to Spain, where tragedy and obsession often took the throne by storm. And in the case of Joanna of Castile, they never truly let go. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, yes, the same Catholic monarchs who funded Columbus, Joanna was royalty from the cradle. Educated, clever, fluent in multiple languages, Joanna was groomed for greatness. But as history tends to go, greatness was not what she received. At age 16, she was married off to Philip the Handsome, the Archduke of Austria, a man as beautiful as his name suggested, and unfortunately, as cold as his bloodline required. Their early love affair was passionate, explosive, so intense, in fact, that Joanna was utterly consumed by it. She became obsessed with Philip, jealously attached, emotionally dependent. And Philip was less attached to anything that didn't wear perfume and flirt with him. He cheated openly. Joanna raged openly. At one point, she reportedly cut the hair of a noblewoman she suspected was seducing her husband. Royal decorum was not her strong suit. But then, the story took a darker turn. In 1506, Philip suddenly died of typhoid, or perhaps poisoning if you ask some sources. Joanna broke. She wept. She screamed. She kissed his corpse. She clung to it so tightly they couldn't pry her off. Then, she refused to bury him. Yes, for 8 months, Queen Joanna traveled across Spain with Philip's coffin, opening it to gaze at his rotting face, weeping beside it at night, sleeping near it, talking to it. Wherever she went, the coffin came, wrapped in black velvet and obsession. She ordered guards to protect it. No women were allowed near it, lest they steal him from her even in death. By this point, everyone agreed Joanna was not well. Whether it was depression, psychosis, or grief-induced delusion, the diagnosis came down as it often did in history: madness. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Eventually, her father Ferdinand, ever the practical one, declared her unfit to rule and locked her away in the convent of Tordesillas. She lived there in seclusion for 46 years, rarely speaking, surrounded by nuns, occasionally still speaking to shadows. Was she truly insane? Or simply devastated by betrayal and loss? Some historians believe her madness was exaggerated, an excuse to remove a politically inconvenient woman from power. But if madness is measured in mourning, in undying attachment, in the refusal to let go, then yes, perhaps Joanna was mad. Madly in love, madly betrayed, madly punished by a world that never let women grieve on their own terms. Joanna's story isn't one of perversion in the usual sense. It's a story of unrelenting emotional ruin, a descent into mourning so deep, the world couldn't stand to look at it. So they closed the convent doors and called her mad. And history, ever eager to brand a woman hysterical, complied. Ah yes, her. You've likely heard the story already. The whispers, the rumors, the one infamous lie that outlived her armies, her reforms, her political brilliance, and even her own grandchildren. Catherine the Great of Russia, empress, reformer, conqueror of Crimea, destroyer of the Ottomans, intellectual, patron of the arts, and, according to centuries of snickering gossips, the woman who died having sex with a horse. Let's take a moment to breathe. No, Catherine did not die from an equine misadventure. She died in bed from a stroke in 1796. The horse story was, and always has been, a lie. a particularly misogynistic, degrading fabrication likely started by French pamphleteers who disliked powerful women, and probably had some unresolved issues with their own mothers. But why Catherine? Because she ruled like a man. She seized the Russian throne in a coup. She modernized education. She corresponded with Voltaire. She wore military uniforms, expanded the empire, and even led armies into war zones. For many, this was intolerable behavior, especially coming from a woman. And so, the myths began. Let's rewind. Catherine, born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, was a minor German princess who married into the Russian royal family at age 16. Her husband, Peter III, was immature, obsessed with toy soldiers, and openly ridiculed by the court. She, on the other hand, read philosophy, spoke multiple languages, and quietly built alliances. When Peter took the throne in 1762, Catherine staged a bloodless coup just 6 months later and took power herself. She ruled for 34 years, and during that time, yes, she had lovers. Many of them, some younger, some clever, some ambitious. She even gave them titles and estates. This apparently was too scandalous to ignore. Men in power took mistresses and fathered dozens of illegitimate children. Perfectly fine. But a woman doing the same? That required punishment, in the form of whispered filth and immortal slander. The horse myth wasn't just crude, it was strategic. It reduced a towering ruler to an animalistic caricature. It said, no matter how powerful you are, if you're a woman, we will bring you low. And history, being the messy chorus of truth and rumor, passed the tale along. It even made its way into textbooks, jokes, cartoons. If you search her name on the internet today, it's still one of the first things that pops up. That's the real tragedy of Catherine's story. Not the coups or betrayals or endless Russian winters, but that centuries later, a lie still outweighs a legacy. That her actual brilliance, her reforms, her expansion of the empire, her patronage of science and literature, is still overshadowed by a story made up by bitter men. There's a lesson in that history is not always written by the victors, it's often rewritten by their enemies. That a lie can outlive a truth if it's just scandalous enough. And that when women claim power, the world often responds not with awe, but with venom. So no, Catherine the Great didn't die under a horse. She died as an empress, alone but not unloved, powerful but still ridiculed. And her ghost, if it lingers, likely rolls its eyes every time someone smirks at that tired, ancient slander. Let us turn now to Joanna of Castile, also known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, a woman whose tragedy has echoed through Spanish history like the slow toll of a cracked cathedral bell. Because sometimes, history doesn't need perversion in the physical sense. Sometimes, it's enough to be emotionally inconvenient, politically threatening, or simply too human. Joanna was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Yes, that Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who gave Christopher Columbus his 3 tiny ships and kicked the Moors out of Spain. Born in 1479, Joanna was intelligent, well-educated, devout, and entirely unprepared for the performance required of queenship. Then came Philip the Handsome, her husband. He was beautiful, charming, and absolutely adored by Joanna. She fell for him so hard it bordered on obsession, which, in medieval royal terms, was considered somewhat unseemly. Women weren't supposed to love their husbands with such fervor. They were meant to produce heirs, smile diplomatically, and not get too attached. But Joanna couldn't help herself, and Philip, flattered at first, quickly grew bored of her devotion. He took mistresses, he mocked her, and Joanna, being deeply in love and human, responded with jealousy, rage, and heartbreak. She cried, she screamed, she lashed out. Normal things for someone being publicly humiliated. Except she was a woman, and a royal, so those outbursts weren't seen as passion. They were labeled as madness. Then Philip died suddenly, possibly poisoned, though no one dared say it out loud. And that's when the real tragedy began. Joanna didn't handle the death well. She reportedly kept Philip's coffin close to her for months. There are tales, likely exaggerated, that she would open it, kiss the corpse, travel with it from town to town, refusing to bury him. Unstable, they said. Insane, they wrote. Completely mad. But was she? Or was this simply a narrative that fit too conveniently into the plans of the powerful men around her? Because here's what followed. Her father, Ferdinand, declared her unfit to rule and locked her in a convent. Then her son, Charles V, kept her there for over 40 years. She lived into her 70s, half a century as a prisoner, not because she was dangerous, but because she was inconvenient. A queen with a claim, a mother with influence, a woman whose grief made men uncomfortable. It's strange, isn't it? How medieval madness so often looked like inconvenient emotion. How grief became diagnosis. How power-hungry relatives found her mental state incredibly useful for their own careers. And in the end, the legends about her madness may have been the most perverted thing of all. Not in the salacious bedroom sense like the others in our tale, but perverted in the twisting of truth, in the way her humanity was weaponized against her, in how her tears were turned into chains and her love into lifelong exile. Joanna may have been broken, or maybe she was just mourning. Either way, she deserved better than to be buried under lies and shadows. A queen not mad, but merely human in a world that didn't allow women that luxury. And now, as we drift toward the end of this long, shadowy corridor of forgotten queens and twisted court tales, perhaps the strangest truth of all emerges. Many of these women were not, in fact, perverted in the way salacious scrolls or late-night rumors claimed. Rather, they were called perverted for being emotional, powerful, curious, sexual, or simply different. And in medieval Europe, that was more than enough to qualify. A queen who enjoyed sex, dangerous. A queen who ruled without apology, threatening. A queen who didn't smile sweetly or obey her husband, scandalous. What's been labeled perversion across centuries has more often been humanity. Queens who loved too deeply, hated too loudly, or dared to desire things forbidden to their gender. It's strange, isn't it, that a woman's grief could be declared insanity, that a woman's ambition could be rewritten as sin, that a woman's pleasure could be a public offense. History, after all, has rarely been neutral. It has had narrators, mostly male, mostly powerful, and very good at editing. And so, over time, truth becomes warped. A kiss becomes a crime. A mistress becomes a monster. A queen becomes a caricature. And we, centuries later, read their stories through that distorted lens. We laugh at their oddities, gasp at their reputations, forget to ask, who wrote this version? And why did they want us to remember her this way? Were these queens truly perverted? Or merely punished for stepping out of line? Did they rule wickedly? Or simply refuse to be quiet? Perhaps it's both. Perhaps some were cruel. Perhaps some were brilliant, some deeply flawed, some desperately sad, some selfish, some brave, but all of them were far more real than the myths have allowed. As you lie there, eyes heavy, head sinking into the pillow, remember, even royalty had sleepless nights. Even queens stared at ceilings, wondering who they could trust or whether history would be kind. It usually wasn't. But tonight, in this small, strange space of quiet and curiosity, we've given them a little air. A little room to be remembered not as monsters, not as madwomen, but simply as people. Flawed, complex, unforgettable. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most royal thing of all.